Officer, if you touch me, you will be obstructing emergency medical care. I am performing a life-saving procedure. Step back and let me do my job.
This is your final warning. You are under arrest for obstruction.
The heat of the Georgia sun was relentless, pressing down on Centennial Park with a thick, humid weight. It was the kind of afternoon where the air itself felt slow, where every sound was muffled by the drone of cicadas. But inside the bubble of controlled chaos surrounding Jada Washington, there was no slowness. There was only the frantic, accelerated rhythm of a life slipping away. Her world had compressed to the few feet of grass where Marcus Thorne lay gasping, his face swelling, his skin turning a mottled, terrifying shade of blue. Anaphylaxis, the body's ultimate betrayal, turning on itself with lethal speed. Jada had been a paramedic for 12 years, 6 of them as a former Air Force pararescueman, a PJ. She had treated blast injuries in the dust of Kandahar and pulled mangled bodies from highway wrecks outside Atlanta. She knew the calculus of life and death was measured in seconds. "His airway is closing, Leo. Strider is getting worse," she yelled, her voice cutting through the panicked sobs of the man's wife. Her partner, Leo Martinez, was already prepping a second dose of epinephrine. The call had come in as a simple allergic reaction, a bee sting, but the patient had a severe, undocumented allergy. What should have been a routine stabilization and transport had become a race against asphyxiation. Jada's hands moved with an economy born of 1,000 similar emergencies. She inserted an oropharyngeal airway to keep his tongue from blocking what little passage remained, her fingers palpating his neck, feeling for the landmarks of the cricothyroid membrane. Intubation was failing. His throat was too swollen. A cricothyrotomy, a surgical airway, was the last desperate option. "Get the cric kit now!" The patient, Marcus, was a big man, a construction worker in his late 40s who had been enjoying a rare day off with his family. Now he was a battlefield. His chest heaved, each breath a high-pitched, whistling struggle. Cyanosis was creeping into his lips and fingertips. His heart rate, once tachycardic, was starting to plummet. Bradycardia, the precursor to cardiac arrest. It was in this moment, as Jada wiped sweat and the patient's saliva from her gloves, ready to make the incision that would save his life, that a shadow fell over them. Heavy, polished boots planted themselves on the grass beside her. "Ma'am, I need you to step away from the individual." The voice was young, laced with an unearned authority that grated on Jada's nerves. She didn't look up. She couldn't. Her focus was absolute. "I'm a paramedic with Grady EMS. This man is in respiratory arrest. I need this scene clear." "I'm Officer Dean Miller, APD. I'm securing the scene. I need to see your identification." Jada's mind reeled with disbelief. Identification? Now? This was the definition of insanity. "Sir, my ID is in the truck. This man will be dead in the next 90 seconds if I don't open his airway. You need to step back." Her tone was flat, devoid of argument. It was a statement of non-negotiable medical fact. "Ma'am, that was not a request. That was a lawful order. Stand up and provide your identification." For the first time, Jada looked up. Officer Miller was maybe 33 with a rigidly set jaw and eyes that seemed to view the entire world as a potential act of non-compliance. His hand was resting on his Glock, a gesture of casual intimidation she'd seen 100 times. He wasn't looking at the dying man on the ground. He was looking only at her, a black woman who had dared to tell him what to do. The dynamic of the scene shifted instantly. It was no longer just a medical emergency. It had become a contest of wills. "Leo, are you ready with that suction?" Jada said, deliberately turning her attention back to her patient. She would not be drawn into the officer's power play, not with a life on the line. She could feel Miller's glare burning into the side of her head. "This is your final warning." Miller's voice was low, dangerous. "You are interfering with a police investigation." "What investigation?" Leo snapped, his own patience evaporating. "It's a bee sting! We're trying to save his life!" The patient's wife, a terrified woman named Sarah, looked at Miller with pleading eyes. "Please, officer, she's helping him. My husband, he can't breathe." Miller ignored them both. His entire focus was a laser beam locked on Jada. To him, her refusal to immediately obey was not the action of a medical professional under pressure. It was an act of insubordination. He saw her focus on her patient as a direct challenge to his authority. He took another step forward, his shadow engulfing the man fighting for his last breaths on the grass. "I said stand up, now!" Jada's training, both military and civilian, had forged a composure of tempered steel. She had been screamed at by drill sergeants and shot at by insurgents. She would not be rattled by a patrolman with a bruised ego. She picked up the scalpel from the kit. The polished steel glinted in the harsh sunlight. "Officer, if you touch me, you will be obstructing emergency medical care, which is a felony in the state of Georgia. I am performing a life-saving procedure under medical direction. Now, for the last time, step back and let me do my job." She lowered the blade toward Marcus Thorne's throat. She had found the small indentation, the membrane she needed to pierce. It was a procedure of millimeters and seconds, but she never got the chance to make the cut. A hand, strong and unyielding, clamped down on her shoulder and yanked her backward with brutal force. The scalpel flew from her grasp, landing uselessly in the grass. Her medical kit overturned, sterile supplies scattering across the dirty ground. Jada stumbled, caught off guard by the sheer violence of the motion. She twisted around to see Officer Miller's face, red with fury, his eyes cold and devoid of reason. "You're under arrest," he snarled, "for obstruction of justice." The world seemed to slow down, the buzz of the cicadas fading into a dull roar in her ears. She could only stare in horror as Leo scrambled to take her place, his face a mask of panic. Above it all, she could hear the terrible whistling sound of Marcus Thorne's breathing begin to fail. The world tilted on its axis. One moment, Jada was a clinician, a highly trained lifesaver poised to intervene. The next, she was a suspect, her body controlled by a force that had no understanding of the catastrophe it was creating. Officer Miller's grip was like iron on her bicep. He spun her around with a practiced, impersonal efficiency that spoke of countless other arrests. The sharp, metallic click-click of the handcuffs locking around her wrists echoed in the sudden, shocked silence of the park. The cold steel bit into her skin, a profound and sickening violation. "What are you doing?" she gasped, not out of fear for herself, but from a surge of pure, unadulterated panic for the man on the ground. "My patient! He's crashing!" She craned her neck, trying to see past Miller's rigid form. Leo was on his knees beside Marcus, his hands shaking as he fumbled to re-establish the airway Jada had been managing. The precious seconds were hemorrhaging. "You should have thought of that before you decided to obstruct," Miller said, his voice flat and self-righteous. He tightened his grip, pulling her arms up behind her back to an uncomfortable angle. A chorus of outrage erupted from the small crowd of bystanders that had gathered. Cell phones were already up, dozens of tiny lenses recording the unfolding insanity. "He's arresting the paramedic!" someone shouted. "What the hell is wrong with you? She was trying to save him!" Sarah Thorne, the patient's wife, let out a wail of despair and fury. She lunged toward Miller, her hands outstretched. "Let her go! You're killing my husband! Please, God, somebody help!" Another officer, Miller's partner who had been managing the perimeter, quickly stepped in to intercept the distraught woman, holding her back as she sobbed. Jada's mind, trained for crisis, was racing, trying to process the sheer irrationality of the situation. This wasn't a complex crime scene. It was a medical emergency in broad daylight. There was no threat, no weapon, no crime being committed other than the one Miller was now perpetrating. He was arresting a paramedic, in uniform, during active patient care. It was an act so profoundly stupid, so grossly negligent, that it defied belief. "Officer, listen to me," Jada said, forcing her voice into a calm, steady cadence, fighting the tremor of adrenaline. "My name is Jada Washington. I am a licensed paramedic. The man on the ground is Marcus Thorne. He is in anaphylactic shock. He is experiencing a complete airway obstruction. If he is not surgically intubated in the next minute, he will suffer catastrophic brain damage or die. You are directly interfering with his only chance of survival. She was not pleading. She was documenting. She was creating a verbal record for the cameras she knew were rolling. Miller's response was to shove her forward, toward his patrol car parked haphazardly on the grass. "You can tell it to the sergeant." He seemed completely deaf to the medical reality she was describing, insulated by a bubble of his own authority. In his world, a uniform and a badge trumped a stethoscope and a medical license. The refusal to show an ID was the only crime he could see. She stumbled, her ankles unsteady in her duty boots, her balance thrown off by the handcuffs. She risked a final, desperate look over her shoulder. Leo was pressing the bag valve mask to Marcus's face, a futile effort against a completely closed airway. Marcus's body was beginning to convulse, a hypoxic seizure. His life was extinguishing, right there on the grass, a direct result of this officer's fragile ego. A wave of professional nausea washed over Jada. It was the deepest, most fundamental violation of her oath. Primum non nocere. First, do no harm. And here, harm was being actively, deliberately inflicted by a man sworn to protect. As Miller pushed her against the hot metal of his patrol car, she could see his partner speaking frantically into his shoulder radio, his eyes wide with an alarm that suggested he, at least, understood the magnitude of the disaster Miller had just created. The siren of a second ambulance grew louder, a desperate wailing sound that was arriving far too late. Miller opened the back door and pushed her inside. The seat was hard plastic, molded for discomfort and compliance. The air inside was stifling, thick with the smell of stale coffee and antiseptic. As the heavy door slammed shut, caging her in, she pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass. She watched as two new paramedics sprinted from the newly arrived ambulance, their faces grim. They swarmed over Marcus Thorne, their movements urgent and desperate. They had a chance, but it was a chance diminished by 7 minutes. 7 minutes of ego, 7 minutes of madness, 7 minutes stolen from a man who had none to spare. In the back of that car, helpless and bound, Jada Washington wasn't just a paramedic under arrest. She was the first and most critical witness to an act of state-sponsored attempted murder. The world outside the patrol car's window played out like a silent, horrifying film. The metal grid of the cage partition pressed against Jada's cheek as she strained to see, to understand, to somehow will a different outcome from her plastic prison. The new paramedic crew from Station 12 moved with the desperate efficiency of a team arriving at a catastrophe already in progress. Jada knew them. The lead medic was a man named David Chen, a veteran with steady hands and a calming presence. She saw him kneel, assess the situation in a fraction of a second, and immediately call for the surgical crick kit. He was doing exactly what she had been about to do, but the clock was broken. The seamless chain of care had been shattered. Leo was talking to David, his hands gesturing wildly, his face pale with shock and fury as he recounted what had happened. He pointed toward Miller's patrol car, and David's head snapped up. His eyes met Jada's through the glass, and his expression shifted from professional focus to utter disbelief. For a moment, the entire scene seemed to freeze, a tableau of madness under the oppressive Georgia sun. A dying man, a frantic medical team, a distraught wife, and the paramedic who should have been in charge, sitting in handcuffs in the back of a police car. Officer Miller stood outside the car, his back to Jada, speaking into his radio. His posture was rigid, defensive. He wasn't watching the medical drama he had caused. He was crafting his narrative, justifying the unjustifiable to a dispatcher's disembodied voice. Jada could imagine the words. Uncooperative female. Refuse to identify. Obstructing. Simple, clean words to sanitize an ugly, complex reality. Through the window, she watched David Chen make the incision. It was quick, precise. A moment later, they were bagging Marcus through the new airway, forcing oxygen into his starved lungs. His chest began to rise and fall in a rhythm dictated by his rescuers, not his own failing body. They were working furiously, starting new IV lines, pushing more drugs, epinephrine, steroids, antihistamines, a full-court press to pull him back from the brink. But the damage was done. The hypoxic seizures, the period of oxygen deprivation, those were bells that could not be unrung. They loaded him onto the stretcher. His body was limp, an inert weight. As they wheeled him toward their ambulance, Sarah, his wife, ran alongside, her hand clutching his, her face a mess of tears and terror. Before climbing into the ambulance, David Chen shot one last look at Miller's car, a look of such pure, cold contempt that Jada felt it even through the glass. Then the ambulance doors slammed shut, the siren screamed to life, and it pulled away, leaving a void on the grass where a man's life had almost ended. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of Miller's radio and the distant city hum. Jada leaned her head back against the hard seat. The adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, heavy dread. Her duty had been abandoned, wrested from her by force. A sacred trust between medic and patient had been violated, not by a failure of her skills or knowledge, but by the arbitrary and reckless actions of one man. Miller finally opened the driver's side door and slid into the seat. He adjusted his rearview mirror, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection for a brief, empty moment. He said nothing. He didn't offer a justification. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply started the engine. "You have any idea what you just did?" Jada's voice was low, controlled, but vibrated with a contained fury. "I was doing my job," Miller stated, his eyes fixed on the windshield. "You were interfering. My job is to keep people alive. Your job is not to stop me. That man is probably going to have severe brain damage if he even survives. That is on you. His blood is on your hands." A muscle twitched in Miller's jaw, the only sign that her words had registered. "If you had complied, there would have been no delay." The circular logic was staggering. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance left her speechless. He had created the crisis, and now he was blaming her for the consequences. It was the logic of an abuser. In that moment, Jada knew this was no longer just about a wrongful arrest. This was about accountability. This was about ensuring that Dean Miller, and any officer who thought like him, would never be in a position to make such a monstrously ignorant decision again. The drive to the precinct began, each block they traveled taking her further from her calling and deeper into a system that had just declared war on it. She was no longer just a paramedic. She was now a plaintiff. The drive to the Atlanta Police Department's Zone 5 precinct was a surreal journey through a city that seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding within the patrol car. Tourists milled around World of Coke, business people hurried along Peachtree Street, and life went on, vibrant and loud. Inside the car, a cold, suffocating silence reigned. Jada focused on her breathing, a rhythmic cadence she'd learned in the military to control fear and pain. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4. She cataloged every detail: the route they were taking, the time on the car's dashboard clock, the call signs she heard crackling over the radio. She was no longer just a victim of the system. She was a student of it, gathering the evidence she would need to dismantle the injustice being done to her. When they arrived at the precinct, Miller walked her inside with a proprietary grip on her arm, as if she were a common criminal. The air in the station was cool and smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Heads turned as they entered. A paramedic in uniform, in handcuffs, was not a common sight. She saw expressions of confusion, curiosity, and on the faces of a few older, more seasoned officers, a flicker of weary concern. They knew this image was not good for anyone. A portly, gray-haired sergeant at the front desk looked up from his computer, his eyebrows rising into his hairline. "Miller, what in God's name is this?" "Arrested for obstruction and refusal to identify, Sarge," Miller announced, his voice carrying a note of defensive pride. She was interfering with a medical assistance call. The sergeant, whose nameplate read Wallace, blinked slowly, as if the words weren't computing. She was the medical assistant, you idiot. That's Jada Washington from Grady. She's one of the best medics in the city. He looked past Miller, his eyes meeting Jada's with a look of profound apology. Jada, you all right? I'd be better if my patient wasn't on his way to the ICU because your officer thinks his authority is more important than a man's life, Jada replied, her voice steady and clear. Wallace winced, the color draining from his face. He knew exactly what that meant. The liability, the optics, the sheer unmitigated wrongness of it. He jabbed a thumb toward a small office. Miller, in here, now! Miller's confident facade wavered for the first time. He shot Jada a venomous glare before following the sergeant into the office, the door closing behind them with a sharp click. Jada was left standing in the middle of the booking area with another officer who seemed deeply uncomfortable with the entire situation. He led her to a bench and, after a moment's hesitation, spoke into his radio to get authorization to remove the handcuffs. The release of the steel cuffs from her wrists was a small mercy, but the deep red marks they left behind were a stark reminder of her humiliation. The booking process began, a dehumanizing ritual of paperwork and procedure. Fingerprints were taken, her face captured in a flat, emotionless mugshot. The most surreal part was the inventory of her belongings. The officer pulled items from her uniform pockets and cataloged them with bureaucratic detachment. Her trauma shears, her pen light, her wallet, which contained her driver's license, her credit cards, and the very thing that had started this whole nightmare, her state-issued paramedic license. The young booking officer paused when he saw it, turning the plastic card over in his hands. He read the certifications listed: Paramedic, Advanced Cardiac Life Support, Pediatric Advanced Life Support, Pre-Hospital Trauma Life Support. He looked from the card to her face, then back to the card. He didn't have to say anything. The absurdity of charging a woman with these credentials for interfering with a medical call was written all over his face. She was allowed one phone call. She didn't call a family member. She called her station captain, a man named Frank Dorsey who had been her mentor for a decade. Her voice was pure steel. Frank, it's Jada. I've been arrested. Zone 5. Officer Dean Miller. He pulled me off a critical anaphylaxis patient at Centennial Park. The patient was crashing. I need you to call the union rep and I need you to get a lawyer. The best civil rights attorney you can find. She could hear the stunned silence on the other end of the line, followed by a string of curses. Jada, are you serious? What happened to the patient? Transported by Station 12. He was circling the drain when they left. Hypoxic seizures. I don't know his status, she said, the clinical words feeling like ash in her mouth. Just make the calls, Frank. This isn't going away. After the call, they led her to a holding cell. The heavy metal door slammed shut, the sound echoing the finality of her situation. She sat on the cold, concrete bench, the sterile, impersonal environment, a stark contrast to the visceral life-and-death reality she had inhabited just an hour before. She looked at her hands, the hands that were trained to heal, now smudged with fingerprint ink. The system had processed her, chewed her up, and spit her out into this cage. But they had made a grave miscalculation. They thought they had caged a criminal. What they had actually done was cage a witness who remembered every single detail, and she was ready to burn them to the ground with the truth. Time in a holding cell has a different texture. It's thick, slow, and punctuated by the random noises of the precinct. A ringing phone, a burst of laughter, the distant clang of another metal door. Jada sat on the bench, her back straight, refusing to let the cold concrete seep into her resolve. She replayed the incident in her mind, not with emotion, but with the cold, analytical precision she applied to a medical diagnosis. She broke it down, moment by moment. Miller's approach, his words, her responses, the position of the witnesses, the angle of the sun. She was building her case, organizing the facts into an unshakable timeline. She had been in the cell for what felt like an eternity, but was probably less than an hour, when she saw Sergeant Wallace approaching. He stopped outside the bars, his face etched with a weary frustration. He looked like a man who had just lost a fight he knew he couldn't win. "The chief knows," Wallace said, his voice low. "My report is already on his desk. Miller is on administrative leave pending an investigation." "Administrative leave is a paid vacation, Sergeant," Jada replied, her voice flat. "It's not accountability." Wallace sighed, running a hand over his tired face. "Look, Washington, I know this is bad. It's as bad as it gets. Miller's a hothead. He's got a history of escalating things. We all know it. But he's never done anything like this." "A history?" Jada's senses sharpened. "How many complaints?" Wallace hesitated, looking over his shoulder. "A few. Excessive force, verbal abuse. Nothing that ever stuck. The union lawyer always gets him out of it." He had said more than he should have, but Jada could see the conflict in his eyes. He was a man caught between loyalty to the blue line and his own conscience. Before she could press him further, a new figure appeared in the hallway. A woman in a sharply tailored gray suit carrying a leather briefcase. She walked with a sense of purpose that seemed to part the air in front of her. She was in her late 40s, with keen, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She stopped in front of Jada's cell and gave Sergeant Wallace a look that could have curdled milk. "Sergeant, my client is being held illegally. I suggest you open this door before we add unlawful detention to the list of charges." Wallace, to his credit, didn't argue. He nodded to a nearby officer who unlocked the cell door. The woman extended a hand to Jada. "Jada Washington? I'm Evelyn Reed. Your union sent me. I specialize in civil rights cases, particularly those involving official misconduct. Let's go somewhere we can talk." Relief, potent and unexpected, washed over Jada. This was not just a union lawyer. This was a fighter. Evelyn Reed's reputation preceded her. She was known for taking on police departments and winning. She was sharp, relentless, and deeply committed to holding power accountable. They were given a small, grim interrogation room. As soon as the door closed, Evelyn opened her briefcase and pulled out a legal pad. "All right, Jada. I've spoken to your captain and your partner, Leo. I have their preliminary statements. Now I need to hear it from you. Every single detail, from the moment the call came in. Don't filter, don't summarize. Tell me everything." For the next hour, Jada recounted the events with meticulous clarity. She described the patient's condition, the exact medical terms, the interventions she was performing. She repeated the conversations with Miller verbatim, her memory a high-fidelity recording of the incident. She described his body language, his tone, the placement of his hand on his weapon. Evelyn listened, her pen flying across the page, only interrupting to ask for clarification on a specific point. "Did he ever identify what crime he was investigating?" "No, he just said I was interfering." "Did he render any aid to the patient after he arrested you?" "No, he turned his back on him." "Were there witnesses?" "The patient's wife." "My partner." "And at least a dozen people with cell phones. The whole thing was recorded." A slow, cold smile spread across Evelyn Reed's face. "Good. Video evidence is the great equalizer. It cuts through the he said, she said nonsense." She closed her notepad. "Okay, here's what's going to happen. They've charged you with obstruction of a peace officer and resisting arrest without violence. Both are misdemeanors. Both are complete and utter bullshit. The district attorney's office will drop these charges before they even hit a judge's desk. They'd be laughed out of court." She leaned forward, her eyes locking with Jada's. "Getting you out of here and getting the charges dropped is the easy part. That will be done within the hour. The hard part comes next. What do you want to do about this?" Jada didn't hesitate. The image of Marcus Thorne convulsing on the grass was burned into her mind. "I want him off the street," she said, her voice trembling with a quiet rage. "I want to make sure no officer ever thinks they have the right to do this again, to anyone." Evelyn nodded, her smile gone, replaced by a look of grim determination. "Good. That's what I was hoping you'd say. because we're not just going to file a complaint. We're going to file a Section 1983 federal lawsuit for violation of your 4th and 14th Amendment rights. We're going to sue Officer Miller individually, and we're going to sue the City of Atlanta for their failure to train and supervise their officers. We are going to make this so painful for them that they will rewrite their policies from the ground up. She stood up, a general surveying her new battlefield. They picked a fight with the wrong paramedic today, Jada. Now let's go get you out of this cage. Walking out of the precinct into the late afternoon sun felt like surfacing after being held underwater. The air was still hot and heavy, but it was the air of freedom. Jada blinked, her eyes adjusting to the brightness. Her partner, Leo, was waiting by their ambulance, which was parked across the street. Her captain, Frank Dorsey, stood beside him, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud of controlled anger. Leo rushed forward the moment he saw her. "Jada, are you okay? What did they do?" "I'm fine, Leo, just processed." The word felt inadequate, clinical. "What about our patient? What about Marcus?" Leo's face, which had been alight with relief, darkened. He exchanged a look with Frank. "It's bad, Jada. It's really bad." A cold dread, heavier than any jail cell, settled in Jada's stomach. "How bad?" Frank stepped forward, his voice grave. "I just got off the phone with the chief of surgery at Grady Memorial. They got his heart started again in the ER. He arrested twice on the way in. But he was without a stable airway for too long. The hypoxia, it caused a severe anoxic brain injury." The words hit Jada with physical force. Anoxic brain injury. It was one of the most devastating outcomes in emergency medicine. The brain, starved of oxygen, begins to die. The damage was often widespread and irreversible. "They have him on a ventilator in the neuro ICU," Frank continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He's in a coma. The doctors are saying the prognosis is grim. Even if he wakes up, they don't know what his neurological function will be. They're talking about permanent cognitive deficits, paralysis." Jada felt her knees weaken. She leaned against the ambulance, the familiar feel of the vehicle a small, cold comfort. This was the consequence. Not a lawsuit, not a fine, not a lost job. A man's life, his future, his family's world, all shattered because an officer couldn't handle being told to wait. The scalpel that had been in her hand could have prevented this. The simple, life-saving procedure she was seconds away from performing was the difference between a man going home to his family and a man lying unresponsive in an ICU bed, his future a terrifying unknown. Evelyn Reed, who had been standing quietly beside them, placed a hand on Jada's shoulder. "This is what we're fighting for, Jada. This is the damage. This is the quantifiable harm caused by that officer's actions. This is what a jury needs to understand." Jada pushed herself off the ambulance, her grief hardening into a diamond-sharp resolve. The fight was no longer abstract. It had a name and a face. Marcus Thorne. "What about his wife, Sarah?" "She's at the hospital," Leo said quietly. She's a wreck. She keeps asking for you. She told the doctors, the hospital staff, anyone who would listen what happened, that the cops stopped you." This was crucial. The victim's family was already corroborating her story. The narrative was solidifying, and it was a damning one for the APD. "We need to get your official statement, Jada," Frank said, shifting into captain mode. "Internal Affairs will want to talk to you. The city will launch their own investigation." Evelyn immediately stepped in. "She won't be speaking to anyone without me present. No one. Not APD, Internal Affairs, not the city attorneys, nobody. From this moment on, all communication goes through my office. They created this mess. We are not going to help them clean it up." Her authority was absolute. She turned to Jada. "Go home. Get some rest. The next few months are going to be a war. We need you ready." But Jada shook her head. "I can't go home. Not yet." She looked at her ambulance, her gear still inside. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had climbed into the driver's seat for her shift that morning. "I have to finish my shift." Frank and Leo stared at her, stunned. Jada, you don't have to do that, Frank said gently. You've been through enough. Take some time. No, she said, her voice unshakable. Miller took me away from my duty once today. I won't let him do it again. If I go home now, he wins. He made me stop being a paramedic. I need to get back in that truck. It's the only thing that makes sense right now. It was an act of defiance, a reclamation of her identity. She would not be defined by the handcuffs and the holding cell. She was a paramedic. People were hurt, and she was the one who responded. That was who she was. Evelyn Reed watched her, a look of profound respect in her eyes. She understood. This wasn't about stubbornness, it was about survival. As Jada and Leo climbed back into Ambulance 17 to resume their duties, the vow she had made in the cell solidified into a promise. She would fight for Marcus Thorne. She would fight for every patient whose care was ever jeopardized by ego and arrogance. She would fight for the sanctity of her profession. Officer Dean Miller and the city of Atlanta had ignited a fire. Now they were all going to get burned. The days that followed were a blur of procedural machinery grinding into motion. As promised, the district attorney's office dropped the charges against Jada within 48 hours, issuing a terse, one-sentence statement citing a review of the evidence and the interests of justice. It was a quiet, unceremonious admission that the arrest should never have happened, but it came with no apology. It was a legal retreat, not an act of contrition. Jada continued to work, her shifts on the ambulance a strange mix of normalcy and heightened tension. Every call that involved a police presence made her stomach clench. She found herself watching officers on scene with a new, wary eye, analyzing their posture, their tone, searching for the warning signs she had missed with Miller. Her colleagues at Grady EMS rallied around her, their support a silent, solid wall. They knew it could have been any one of them. The incident had sent a shockwave through the first responder community in Atlanta. It wasn't just Jada's fight anymore. It was theirs. Meanwhile, Evelyn Reed moved with the speed and precision of a shark. 3 weeks after the arrest, she filed a comprehensive federal civil rights lawsuit in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia. The defendants were Officer Dean Miller, in his individual capacity, and the city of Atlanta. The complaint was a masterwork of legal prose, a 40-page document that laid out the facts in cold, excruciating detail. It cited violations of Jada's Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable seizure and her 14th Amendment right to due process. It also included state-level claims for false arrest, malicious prosecution, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. But the most powerful count was the one filed on behalf of Marcus Thorne and his family, who had retained Evelyn as co-counsel. Interference with the provision of emergency medical services, resulting in catastrophic and permanent injury. The lawsuit detailed Jada's extensive training and qualifications. It included a minute-by-minute timeline of the medical emergency, cross-referenced with dispatch logs. It described the life-saving procedure she was about to perform. And it quoted verbatim Officer Miller's demands for identification while Marcus Thorne suffocated on the grass. The filing was not just a legal document, it was a damning public narrative. The media picked it up immediately. The story, accompanied by grainy cell phone footage that had been circulating online, became a local, then national firestorm. It was a perfect storm of outrage, a clear abuse of power, a heroic first responder, and a tragic, avoidable outcome for an innocent man. The city of Atlanta's initial response was predictably defensive. The police department issued a statement promising a full and thorough internal investigation, but reminding the public not to rush to judgment. Officer Miller, through his police union attorney, claimed he had followed protocol in securing a chaotic scene and that the paramedic had been uncooperative and aggressive, a version of events so laughably false it was clear they were building a defense for a jury of one, an arbitrator who might be sympathetic to law enforcement. The city's legal department reached out to Evelyn Reed 2 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. Their tone was not conciliatory, it was dismissive. They made an initial settlement offer. Evelyn called Jada to her office to discuss it. "They're trying to posture," to see if we'll scare easily, Evelyn said, sliding a letter across her polished mahogany desk. They're offering a nuisance value settlement. Jada picked up the letter. The city of Atlanta was offering to settle all claims, hers and the Thorne family's, for a total of $75,000. Jada stared at the number, a bitter, incredulous laugh escaping her lips. $75,000? For my career being threatened? For my name being dragged through the mud? For a man's entire future being stolen from him? Is that what they think a life is worth? Marcus Thorne was still in a coma, his condition unchanged. His family was facing a lifetime of medical bills, round-the-clock care, and the devastating loss of the husband and father they knew. It's an insult, Evelyn agreed, her voice hard. It's a strategic one. They're telling us they intend to fight. They're betting that you don't have the stomach for a long, ugly legal battle. They think they can bury us in motions, drag this out for years, and wear you down until you take whatever pennies they throw at you. They're wrong, Jada said, her voice quiet but firm. She pushed the letter back across the desk. Tell them no. Tell them we'll see them in court. Evelyn smiled. I already did. I told them their offer was so offensive it didn't even merit a counter. I told them we would proceed with discovery, and that after we depose Officer Miller and get our hands on his personnel file, our settlement demand would be in the 8-figure range. The city's dismissive offer was a tactical blunder. It wasn't just a lowball number, it was a sign of contempt. It told Jada and Evelyn everything they needed to know about the city's mindset. They didn't see this as a tragedy to be rectified. They saw it as a problem to be managed, a liability to be minimized. They were not interested in justice. They were interested in damage control. That single, insulting offer galvanized Jada's resolve. This was no longer just about holding one officer accountable. It was about taking on the entire system that produced and protected him. The city wanted a fight. Evelyn Reed was more than happy to give them one. The rejection of the city's insulting offer marked the official beginning of the war, the discovery phase. This was the part of litigation where the polished veneers were stripped away, where both sides were legally compelled to turn over their evidence, their documents, and their secrets. For Evelyn Reed, this was the hunt. She immediately filed a sweeping set of discovery requests, demanding everything. Officer Miller's complete personnel file, all internal affairs complaints filed against him, his training records, use of force reports, and every second of body camera and dash camera footage from the incident. The city's attorneys fought back as expected. They filed motions to quash, claiming the requests were overly broad, burdensome, and sought privileged information. It was a standard stonewalling tactic, but Evelyn was prepared. She argued before the federal judge that Miller's past conduct was directly relevant to the city's liability. The lawsuit wasn't just about one officer having a bad day. It was about the city's alleged failure to discipline or retrain an officer with a known pattern of aggressive behavior. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Eleanor Vance, agreed. She ordered the city to produce the files with minor redactions for privacy. It was the first major victory of the case. When the boxes of documents arrived at Evelyn's office, it was like unearthing a buried history. Jada sat with Evelyn and her legal team for days, poring over the contents of Dean Miller's career. What they found was not a single shocking revelation, but a slow, sickening pattern of behavior. In his 8 years with the APD, Miller had accumulated 19 citizen complaints. The number itself was startlingly high for an officer of his tenure. The nature of the complaints told the story. They were a litany of unnecessary escalations. A traffic stop for a broken taillight that ended with the driver, a college professor, being slammed against his car for arguing. An encounter with a homeless man that resulted in the man being arrested for disorderly conduct after he refused to move from a public sidewalk. A domestic dispute where Miller arrested the female victim for obstruction because she wouldn't let him into her home without a warrant. In every case, the pattern was the same. Miller would issue a command. If he met with anything other than immediate, unquestioning compliance, a question, a hesitation, an assertion of rights, he interpreted it as a challenge to his authority and responded with overwhelming force or a punitive arrest. He was a bully with a badge. Even more damning was how the APD's Internal Affairs Division had handled these complaints. Of the 19, 17 were dismissed as unfounded or unsubstantiated. The other 2 resulted in a simple letter of counseling, the department's equivalent of a slap on the wrist. He had never been suspended. He had never been demoted. He had never faced any meaningful consequences for his behavior. The system hadn't just failed to stop him, it had actively enabled him. It had taught him that his actions had no repercussions. "This is gold, Jada," Evelyn said, tapping a thick stack of complaint files. "This isn't a pattern, it's a roadmap. It shows that the city was on notice. They knew they had a problem officer, an officer who was a walking liability, and they did nothing. They let him continue unchecked until his arrogance finally led to a real catastrophe, the one with you and Marcus Thorne." But the most powerful piece of evidence was yet to come. After weeks of technical delays and excuses, the city finally turned over the body camera footage. Evelyn's paralegal loaded the file, and they watched it on the large screen in her conference room. The video was jarringly clear, the audio crisp. It began with Miller getting out of his car, the mundane sounds of the park filling the air. Then he approached the scene. The camera showed exactly what Jada remembered, a desperate medical situation. It captured Leo Martinez bagging the patient, Jada preparing her equipment, the patient's wife sobbing. It was a scene of controlled medical urgency, not chaos. Then they heard Miller's voice, sharp and demanding. They watched as he ignored the dying man and focused solely on Jada. They saw her calm, professional responses. The camera recorded every word she said about the patient's condition, every plea from the patient's wife. And then it captured the moment of the arrest. The camera lurched as Miller grabbed her, the audio filled with the sounds of the struggle, the spilled equipment, and Jada's cry of disbelief. The lens tilted down, showing her hands being forced behind her back, the handcuffs clicking shut. It was irrefutable. The video didn't just support Jada's version of events, it was Jada's version of events. It exposed Miller's report, where he claimed Jada had been hostile and physically resistant, as a complete fabrication. The unblinking eye of his own camera had become her best witness. They watched the footage 3 times in stunned silence. The video was more than just evidence. It was a story, a visceral 9-minute film about the collapse of reason and the catastrophic consequences of a fragile ego. And Evelyn Reed knew, with absolute certainty, that it was the weapon that would win them the war. The body camera footage was not merely a piece of evidence. It was the entire case encapsulated in 9 minutes and 47 seconds of high-definition video. Evelyn Reed's legal team treated it like a sacred text, breaking it down second by second, creating a synchronized transcript that aligned the video with the dispatch logs and the witness statements. They weren't just watching a video, they were dissecting a disaster. The analysis began with the first 30 seconds. Miller exits his vehicle. The audio picks up the dispatcher's voice, clearly stating it's a Code 3 medical, possible anaphylaxis. He was informed of the nature of the emergency before he ever took a single step. Yet, as he approaches, his first words are not, "What do you need?" or "How can I help?" They are a command. "I need everyone to back up. I'm securing the scene." At the 1-minute mark, he confronts Jada. The camera angle from his chest shows a clear view of Marcus Thorne. The man's face is visibly swollen, his skin has a distinct bluish tinge, and his breathing is audible, a strained, high-pitched wheeze. Any layperson could see this was a dire emergency. A trained police officer should have recognized the signs of a life-threatening event immediately. Miller, however, seems to look right through the dying man. His focus is entirely on the person in charge, Jada. Evelyn pointed to the screen. "Right here. This is where his bias kicks in. He sees a black woman in a position of authority, giving orders, and his training, or his prejudice, tells him she needs to be brought into line. He doesn't see a paramedic saving a life. He sees a challenge. The transcript highlighted the critical exchange. Miller: "Ma'am, I need to see your identification." Jada: "Sir, I'm in the middle of treating a critical patient. He is in respiratory arrest." Miller: "That's not what I asked. I gave you a lawful order. Show me your ID." Her explanation was met not with understanding, but with escalation. The footage showed Jada never raised her voice. Her tone was firm, clinical, and focused. She was communicating essential information. Miller's tone, in contrast, grew increasingly aggressive and personal. The camera captured the subtle shifts in his body language, the puffed-out chest, the slight widening of his stance, the way his hand drifted down to his belt. The most damning sequence occurred around the 4-minute mark. Jada explicitly states, "I am about to perform a surgical cricothyrotomy. If I do not, this man will die." She holds up the scalpel, not as a threat, but as a demonstration of her intent. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return. A reasonable officer, even one feeling his authority was challenged, would have recognized the stakes and backed off. Miller did the opposite. The video shows him physically moving forward, grabbing her shoulder. The camera shakes violently. The audio explodes with the shouts of bystanders, the clang of falling medical equipment, and Miller's voice, guttural with rage, shouting, "You're under arrest!" The lens is pointed at the ground, then the sky, then Jada's back as he forces her hands behind her. "And there it is," Evelyn said, pausing the video on the image of Jada's face, a mask of shock and disbelief. He had a choice, a dying man on one hand and his own ego on the other. He chose his ego, and his own camera recorded him doing it. The rest of the footage was just as incriminating. It recorded him ignoring his own partner's hesitant pleas to rethink this. It recorded the patient's wife's hysterical screams. It recorded him telling Jada, "This is your fault," as he shoved her into his car. He was not just an officer who made a mistake. He was an officer constructing a false narrative in real time, blaming the victim for his own catastrophic failure of judgment. Evelyn's team prepared a presentation for the eventual trial. They would play the video for the jury on a massive screen. They would pause it at key moments. They would show them Miller's face, Jada's face, and Marcus Thorne's face. They would let the objective, unblinking eye of the camera tell the story. They would compare the reality of the video with the fiction of Miller's official report, which they now had. In his report, Miller had written, "The subject, later identified as Jada Washington, was belligerent and uncooperative. She refused to follow lawful orders to clear the scene. When I attempted to detain her, she physically resisted, requiring me to use necessary force to effect the arrest." "Every single sentence in that paragraph is a lie," Evelyn stated, her voice cold. "And we have the video to prove it. At his deposition, I'm going to make him watch this video. I'm going to make him read his report out loud. And then I'm going to ask him to explain to me how both of those things can possibly be true. He's not just going to be exposed as a bad cop. He's going to be exposed as a liar." The body camera, a tool intended to promote police accountability, was about to fulfill its purpose in the most spectacular way imaginable. It had captured the truth, raw and unfiltered. And that truth was going to cost Officer Miller his career and the city of Atlanta millions of dollars. The deposition of Officer Dean Miller took place in a sterile, soulless conference room at a neutral law firm. The air was thick with tension. On one side of the long table sat Miller, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was slightly too tight, flanked by a grim-faced attorney from the police union and a lawyer from the city's legal department. On the other side sat Evelyn Reed, cool and composed, with Jada beside her. A court reporter was positioned at the head of the table, her fingers poised over her stenotype machine, ready to capture every word. Depositions are not about grand speeches or surprising revelations. They are a grueling, meticulous process of locking a witness into their testimony under oath. For Evelyn, it was a surgical procedure. Her goal was to dismantle Dean Miller, piece by piece. She began gently, establishing the basics: his name, his years of service, his training. Miller's answers were short, clipped, and confident. He projected an air of professional competence, the image of a seasoned officer who had seen it all. Then, Evelyn shifted to the day of the incident. "Officer Miller, please describe for me your understanding of the dispatch call you received regarding the incident at Centennial Park." "It was a medical call," Miller said, "a possible allergic reaction." "So you were aware before arriving that you were responding to a medical emergency, not a crime in progress?" "Yes," he admitted, a slight hesitation in his voice. Evelyn had him walk through his arrival on the scene. He described it as chaotic, with multiple people shouting. It was the beginning of his attempt to paint a picture that would justify his actions. "And in this chaotic scene, you saw my client, Ms. Washington, treating the patient, Mr. Thorne." "I saw her kneeling over him. I couldn't verify who she was or what she was doing." "Did you observe the patient's condition, officer?" Evelyn asked, her tone conversational. "I observed the scene as a whole." "That's not my question. Did you observe Mr. Thorne? Did you notice that his face was swollen, that his skin was blue, that he was making audible, high-pitched breathing sounds?" Miller shifted in his chair. "My first priority was to secure the scene and identify all parties involved." "So the answer is no. You did not assess the immediate life-threatening medical condition of the man on the ground." The union lawyer interjected. "Objection, asked and answered." Evelyn ignored him. "You can answer the question, officer." Miller's jaw tightened. "I am not a paramedic. I was there to perform a law enforcement function." "And you believe that function superseded the life-saving efforts of a licensed paramedic?" "Objection!" the lawyer snapped. "Argumentative." "I'll rephrase," Evelyn said smoothly. She then had a paralegal set up a large monitor at the end of the table. "Officer Miller, I'd like to show you what's been marked as Plaintiff's Exhibit A. This is the footage from your own body camera." She played the video. The room was silent, save for the audio from the screen. Jada watched Miller's face. A muscle in his cheek began to twitch. He refused to look at the monitor, staring instead at a fixed point on the far wall. Evelyn paused the video at the moment Miller grabbed Jada. "Officer, in the video my client has just informed you she is about to perform a surgical airway. The patient is visibly in distress. Can you explain to me what part of her action constituted a threat that required you to physically assault and arrest her?" "I didn't assault her," Miller stammered, his composure finally cracking. "I used the necessary force to effect a lawful arrest." "For what crime, officer?" "Obstruction." "What was she obstructing?" Evelyn pressed, her voice like ice. "Was she obstructing your view? Was she obstructing traffic? Or was she, perhaps, obstructing your desire to feel in control?" "Objection!" Evelyn then handed Miller a copy of his official report. "Officer, could you please read the final paragraph aloud for the record?" He read the words in a low monotone, the sentences about Jada being belligerent and physically resistant, hanging in the silent room. "Now, Officer Miller," Evelyn said, leaning forward, "we have all just watched the video. We have all just heard your sworn report. My question is simple. Which one is the lie? The video from your own camera, or the report you signed your name to?" Miller stared at her, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked to his lawyer, who could offer him no help. He was trapped between his own lies and the objective, unchangeable truth of the recording. My recollection in the report," he began, faltering, "was based on my perception of a tense and rapidly evolving situation." "Your perception?" Evelyn's voice was laced with disbelief. "So your perception is that a calm, professional woman telling you she is saving a man's life is belligerent? Your perception is that a woman being violently pulled away from her patient is physically resisting? Is that your sworn testimony today, officer?" The deposition continued like that for 6 grueling hours. Evelyn picked apart every decision, every statement, every inconsistency. By the end, Dean Miller was a shadow of the confident officer who had walked in that morning. His arrogance had been stripped away, layer by layer, revealing the petty, insecure bully beneath. He had been so thoroughly discredited by his own words and his own video that the city's lawyer spent the final hour just staring down at his legal pad, no longer bothering to even object. The deposition was a disaster for the defense, and Evelyn Reed knew that the city's next settlement offer would look very different. A week later, the roles were reversed. It was Jada's turn to be deposed, and the city's attorney, a man named Gerald Vance, was tasked with the unenviable job of trying to find a crack in her story. They met in the same sterile conference room, but the atmosphere was entirely different. Where Miller's deposition had been fraught with tension and hostility, Jada's was a study in calm professionalism. She walked in wearing her formal Grady EMS dress uniform, the one reserved for ceremonies and official proceedings. It was a subtle but powerful statement. She was not here as a victim or a plaintiff. She was here as a representative of her profession, a profession that had been assaulted by the actions of the city's employee. Vance began his questioning, his approach cautious. He knew that any aggressive or disrespectful questioning of Jada would play horribly in front of a jury, especially after the body cam footage had established her as the hero of the story. His goal was to try and paint her as rigid, someone whose adherence to her own protocols made her unwilling to cooperate with law enforcement. Ms. Washington, you've been a paramedic for 12 years, is that correct? Vance began. Yes, that's correct. And in those 12 years, you've worked alongside police officers on countless calls, I assume? Yes, hundreds. So you understand the importance of securing a scene, of following the directives of law enforcement personnel, do you not? I understand the importance of a coordinated effort where each professional performs their designated role, Jada corrected him gently. My role is patient care. The police role is scene safety and security. Those roles are meant to support each other, not conflict. Vance shifted his line of attack. On the day in question, when Officer Miller asked you for identification, why did you refuse? I didn't refuse, Jada stated calmly. I deferred. There is a critical difference. I told the officer that I would provide it as soon as the immediate life threat to my patient was managed. My duty, under both my training protocols and state law, is to my patient first, especially during a time-sensitive, life-saving intervention. But couldn't you have taken just a few seconds to show him your ID? Vance pressed. It might have de-escalated the entire situation. This was the core of their defense, to shift the blame onto her. Jada had prepared for this with Evelyn for hours. Mr. Vance, let me be very clear about the medical reality of that moment. My patient, Mr. Thorne, had a completely obstructed airway. His blood oxygen saturation was dropping precipitously. In that specific scenario, seconds, not minutes, but seconds, are the difference between a full recovery and irreversible brain damage or death. The procedure I was about to perform, a cricothyrotomy, requires absolute focus. Turning away to retrieve an ID from the ambulance, which was 30 feet away, could have been a fatal delay. It was not a choice between cooperation and non-cooperation. It was a choice between my patient's life and an officer's procedural request. I will always choose my patient's life. Her answer was so clear, so medically sound, and so ethically unassailable that it left Vance with nowhere to go. He tried to poke holes in her medical judgment. Were you certain a surgical airway was necessary? Weren't there other options? We had already attempted and failed less invasive options, Jada explained, her voice taking on the tone of a patient instructor. We attempted to ventilate with a bag valve mask, but there was no chest rise. We attempted to place an oropharyngeal airway, but the swelling was too severe. Per our protocols, when conventional airway management fails in a patient who cannot be ventilated, the next step is a surgical cricothyrotomy. It was not an optional procedure. It was the only procedure left that could save his life. She was not just a witness, she was an expert. She answered every question with a calm, factual precision that was impossible to refute. She never displayed anger or bitterness, only a deep, unwavering commitment to her professional duty. She explained the physiology of anaphylaxis, the pharmacology of epinephrine, and the legal and ethical framework of her scope of practice. Vance, the city's attorney, grew visibly frustrated. He had no way to undermine her. She was too credible, too knowledgeable, too composed. Every question he asked only served to highlight her competence and, by extension, the sheer ignorance of Officer Miller's actions. The deposition ended after only 3 hours. Vance had run out of questions. As they packed up their briefcases, he approached Evelyn Reed. "My office will be in touch," he said, his voice low and devoid of its earlier confidence. As they walked out of the building, Jada felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. "How did I do?" she asked Evelyn. Evelyn smiled, a genuine, appreciative smile. "Jada, you didn't just give a deposition. You gave a master class. You just taught the city of Atlanta what it means to be a paramedic, and it's going to be a very, very expensive lesson." She knew then that a trial might not even be necessary. After Jada's unshakable testimony, the city's risk management department would be doing some frantic calculations. The price of settling the case was about to go up, dramatically. The fallout from the 2 depositions was immediate and profound. The transcript from Miller's disastrous testimony, filled with contradictions and admissions of negligence, spread like wildfire through the city's legal department. It was a self-inflicted wound, a detailed confession of his own incompetence and dishonesty, all under oath. In contrast, Jada's transcript was a testament to her professionalism and credibility. It read like a textbook on emergency medical care and ethical conduct. The city's legal strategy, which had been built on the flimsy foundation of portraying Jada as uncooperative, had crumbled. They were now facing the terrifying prospect of a jury trial, where the primary evidence would be the damning body cam video and the testimony of a calm, articulate, and deeply sympathetic paramedic, contrasted with a dishonest, aggressive, and utterly unlikable police officer. And hanging over it all was the tragic reality of Marcus Thorne, still lying in a long-term care facility, minimally conscious, a living embodiment of the case's devastating human cost. 2 weeks after Jada's deposition, Evelyn Reed received a call from Gerald Vance. The tone was no longer dismissive or cautious. It was urgent. He wanted to schedule a settlement conference. "The city is prepared to make a new, substantial offer to resolve this matter," he said. They met in a mediator's office, a retired federal judge whose job was to broker a deal and keep the case from going to trial. Jada was there, along with Evelyn, and Marcus Thorne's wife, Sarah, a silent, powerful presence whose grief filled the room. Vance, representing the city, looked tired. The bluster was gone. He began by offering a formal apology to Jada and the Thorne family on behalf of the city of Atlanta. It was a hollow gesture, a strategic move, but it signaled a fundamental shift in their position. They knew they were going to lose. The only question now was how badly. Then came the new offer. The city was prepared to pay a total of $2.5 million. It was a staggering increase from their initial insulting offer of $75,000. It was a number designed to make them stop and think, a number that could provide for Marcus Thorne's lifelong care and compensate Jada for her ordeal. The mediator looked at Evelyn and Jada, expecting them to see this as a major victory. Evelyn let the number hang in the air for a long moment before she spoke. "Mr. Vance, we appreciate that the city is beginning to grasp the reality of its exposure here. But your offer is still not in the same zip code as reality." She slid a folder across the table. "This is a preliminary life care plan for Marcus Thorne. The projected cost of his medical care, therapy, and lost wages over his lifetime is estimated at just over $9 million. That's before we even begin to discuss his pain and suffering, his family's loss of consortium, or the punitive damages a jury will almost certainly award after seeing that video. She then turned to Jada's claim. As for Ms. Washington, this was never just about money. This was about accountability. The city enabled Officer Miller for years. You ignored 19 complaints. You fostered a culture where an officer believed he could arrest a paramedic for saving a life and get away with it. $2.5 million is not the price of justice. It's the price of making a PR problem go away. She looked directly at Vance. Our demand is $20 million, and that's not our opening bid. That's our final number. But more importantly, any settlement must be contingent on two non-negotiable conditions. First, the immediate termination of Dean Miller from the Atlanta Police Department. No more paid leave, no quiet resignation. Termination. Second, the city must agree to a federally monitored consent decree to overhaul its policies and training regarding interactions with emergency medical personnel. The color drained from Vance's face. The monetary demand was huge, but the policy demands were, in some ways, even bigger. A consent decree would mean years of federal oversight and would be a public admission of systemic failure. That's not possible, he stammered. We can't agree to those terms. Then we'll see you in court, Evelyn said, starting to gather her files. Jada spoke for the first time, her voice quiet but ringing with moral authority. Mr. Vance, I became a paramedic to save lives. On that day, your officer stopped me from doing that, and a good man was destroyed. I will not accept 1 penny of the city's money if that man is still wearing a badge. I will not settle this case if the city doesn't commit to real, enforceable changes to ensure this never, ever happens again. This isn't a negotiation for me. It's my line in the sand. Sarah Thorne, her eyes filled with tears, simply nodded in agreement. The city had hoped to buy its way out of trouble. They had miscalculated again. Jada wasn't just seeking compensation, she was demanding reformation. She was using the leverage of her lawsuit to force the very changes that might have prevented her ordeal in the first place. Faced with a choice between a quiet, multi-million-dollar payday and a much harder fight for systemic change, she had chosen the harder fight. The city's desperate gambit had failed. Now they had to face the consequences of a full public trial. The city's refusal to meet their non-negotiable terms meant one thing: trial. The weeks leading up to the court date were a whirlwind of intense preparation. Evelyn Reed's office transformed into a command center for a complex legal assault. The conference room walls were covered in whiteboards detailing jury selection strategy, witness lists, and timelines of evidence presentation. Jada found herself spending more time with lawyers than with patients. She worked with Evelyn and a team of trial consultants to hone her testimony. It wasn't about memorizing a script. It was about learning how to tell her story to a jury of 12 strangers, how to convey the medical urgency and the professional stakes in a way that was clear, compelling, and deeply human. They practiced direct examination, where Evelyn would guide her through the narrative, and cross-examination, where another lawyer on the team would play the role of the city's attorney, trying to trip her up, question her judgment, and provoke an emotional reaction. Jada remained unflappable, her composure the same whether she was in a real deposition or a practice session. The centerpiece of their trial strategy remained the body cam video. They hired a forensic video analyst to enhance the footage and isolate key frames: the image of Marcus Thorne's cyanotic face, the glint of the scalpel in Jada's hand, the look of pure disbelief as the handcuffs were snapped on. They planned to play it for the jury multiple times, from multiple angles if possible, using the footage from bystander cell phones to create a 360-degree view of the incident. But Evelyn knew the video, as powerful as it was, needed a human voice to explain its devastating medical consequences. Their most important witness, after Jada herself, would be Dr. Elena Ramirez, the chief of neurointensive care at Grady Memorial Hospital. She was the physician who had overseen Marcus Thorne's care from the moment he arrived. Dr. Ramirez was a formidable woman in her 50s, with a sharp mind and an air of unimpeachable authority. In her deposition, she had clinically and methodically explained the science of anoxic brain injury. She used charts and diagrams to show how oxygen deprivation systematically destroys brain cells, moving from higher cognitive functions to the core, autonomic systems that control breathing and heartbeat. Evelyn's team prepared her for the stand, knowing the city's lawyers would try to argue that Marcus Thorne's outcome was not guaranteed, that he might have suffered the same fate even without the delay. Dr. Ramirez was prepared to shut that argument down completely. The single most critical factor in the outcome of a catastrophic airway obstruction is time, she had stated in her deposition, her words precise and powerful. We have extensive data on this. The window for intervention before permanent severe neurological damage occurs is incredibly small. We're talking about 4 to 6 minutes. The delay caused by Officer Miller's intervention, which based on the dispatch logs was approximately 7 minutes from the time he initiated contact to the time the second ambulance crew could perform the cricothyrotomy, was not just a contributing factor, it was the determining factor. He took a salvageable patient and made him unsalvageable. In medical terms, his actions transformed a chance at recovery into a certainty of lifelong, profound disability. Her testimony would be the scientific anchor of the case. She would translate the chaotic video into the cold, hard language of medicine. She would explain to the jury in no uncertain terms that Dean Miller's actions had created a cascade of cellular death from which Marcus Thorne would never recover. The night before the trial was set to begin, Jada couldn't sleep. She sat in her small apartment, her dress uniform hanging clean and pressed on her closet door. She thought about the jury, the strangers who would hold her reputation and Marcus's future in their hands. She thought about facing Dean Miller in court, about looking him in the eye as she told the world what he had done. A wave of anxiety, the first she had truly allowed herself to feel, washed over her. Was it worth it? The stress, the public scrutiny, the emotional toll. She could have taken the city's second offer. It was enough money to ensure she never had to work again, enough to help the Thorne family. But it wouldn't have changed anything. Miller would still be an officer. The department's policies would still be flawed. The next paramedic in her position would still be vulnerable. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. She opened it to find a picture. It was of a smiling, healthy Marcus Thorne, taken a year before the incident. He was standing on a beach with his wife, his arm around her, both of them laughing into the sun. Below the picture was a simple message. "This is who we are fighting for. Thank you. Sarah Thorne." The anxiety vanished, replaced by the same steely resolve she'd felt in the back of that patrol car. She knew she had made the right choice. The battle wasn't just hers anymore. It was for Marcus, for Sarah, for every patient and every provider who might one day find themselves at the mercy of unchecked authority. She was ready. The trial began on a crisp October morning. The federal courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled with reporters, police union officials, paramedics from Grady and other services, and members of the public drawn in by the high-profile case. Jada sat at the plaintiff's table with Evelyn and Sarah Thorne, a united front of quiet dignity. Across the aisle, Dean Miller sat with his legal team, his face a stony, unreadable mask. The jury selection process had been meticulous. Evelyn had sought jurors who were analytical, who valued professionalism, and who showed a healthy skepticism of absolute authority. The final panel of 12 was a diverse cross-section of Atlanta, a retired school teacher, an IT project manager, a young graphic designer, a warehouse foreman. They were ordinary citizens about to be handed an extraordinary responsibility. The trial lasted for 8 days. Evelyn Reed's opening statement was a masterclass in narrative storytelling. She didn't begin with legal arguments. She began with the sound of a man gasping for breath. She painted a vivid picture of Jada's life-saving efforts, then described how that scene of healing was shattered by an officer's ego. The city's defense attorney countered, attempting to frame Miller as a dedicated officer trying to maintain order in a chaotic and uncertain environment. He argued that Jada's refusal to comply had escalated the situation, a narrative that already felt thin and would soon be shredded by the evidence. The core of the trial was the body cam footage. Evelyn played it for the jury on a screen the size of a wall. The sights and sounds of the incident filled the courtroom, raw and undeniable. Jurors flinched when Miller grabbed Jada. They leaned forward, their faces etched with concentration, as they watched a medical professional being arrested while her patient deteriorated. Evelyn played it once without comment, letting it speak for itself. Then, she called Jada to the stand and played it again, pausing at key moments to have Jada explain the medical significance of what was happening on screen. Jada's testimony was powerful in its restraint. She was a teacher, not a victim, explaining the science of anaphylaxis and the ethics of her profession. She never raised her voice. She never wept. She simply stated the facts, her credibility shining through every calm, precise answer. The cross-examination was brief and ineffective. The city's lawyer could find no angle of attack that didn't make him look like a bully. Dr. Elena Ramirez followed, and her testimony was devastating. She used anatomical models and brain scans of Marcus Thorne to give the jury a visual lesson in neurology. She explained that the 7-minute delay was, from a medical standpoint, an eternity. Her expert opinion was unequivocal. Officer Miller's actions were the direct and proximate cause of Mr. Thorne's catastrophic and noxic brain injury. When Dean Miller took the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. He was defensive and sullen. Under Evelyn's relentless cross-examination, his carefully constructed narrative fell apart. Confronted with the video that contradicted his sworn report, he became flustered and argumentative. He repeatedly fell back on phrases like, "my training," and "officer safety," words that sounded hollow and self-serving in the face of the human tragedy he had caused. By the time he stepped down, he had done more to help the plaintiff's case than his own. In her closing argument, Evelyn stood before the jury, her voice ringing with conviction. "This is not just a case about one bad arrest," she said. "It is a case about what we value as a society. Do we value life, or do we value blind obedience? Do we empower those who heal, or those who obstruct?" The city of Atlanta enabled Officer Miller. They ignored 19 warning signs. They taught him that his authority was absolute. On that day in Centennial Park, he acted on that lesson. And the result is that Jada Washington was put in handcuffs, and Marcus Thorne was given a life sentence. She gestured to Jada, and then to Sarah Thorne. "Your verdict today will not heal Marcus Thorne. It will not erase the trauma Jada Washington endured, but it will send a message. It will send a message to the city of Atlanta and to police departments across this country that this is not acceptable. That the person saving a life is more important than the person demanding a piece of plastic. The message is simple: do better." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, the foreman, a middle-aged woman with a resolute expression, handed the verdict form to the clerk. Jada held her breath, her hand finding Sarah's under the table. The clerk's voice was clear and steady. "On the claim of false arrest, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff, Jada Washington. On the claim of violation of civil rights, we find for the plaintiff. On the claim of interference with medical care, we find for the plaintiff." He continued through all the counts, a clean sweep. Then came the damages. "For the compensatory and medical damages for the Thorne family, we award $14 million. For the pain and suffering and violation of rights for Jada Washington, we award $5 million. And finally, the punishment. For punitive damages against Officer Dean Miller, we award $600,000. A collective gasp went through the courtroom, a total of $19.6 million. It was one of the largest civil rights verdicts in the state's history. Jada let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding, tears finally streaming down her face. Sarah Thorne sobbed openly, a release of months of pent-up grief and anger. It wasn't just money, it was validation. It was accountability. It was a roar of justice from 12 ordinary citizens who had been shown the truth and refused to look away. The verdict landed like a seismic shockwave, not just within the city of Atlanta, but across the landscape of law enforcement and emergency services nationwide. The sum, $19.6 million, was a headline-grabbing number, a figure so large it was impossible to ignore. It was a clear, unambiguous message from a jury of citizens. Abuse of power carries a price, and a steep one. For Dean Miller, the consequences were swift and final. The day after the verdict, the Atlanta chief of police held a press conference. Flanked by the mayor, he announced that, based on the findings of the internal investigation and the evidence presented at trial, Dean Miller's employment with the Atlanta Police Department was terminated, effective immediately. There was no union protection that could shield him from the fallout of such a public and costly disaster. His career in law enforcement was over, his name now a synonym for the catastrophic failure of judgment. The punitive damages awarded by the jury would follow him for the rest of his life, a personal financial ruin to match the professional one. For the city of Atlanta, the verdict was a moment of reckoning. The massive financial payout forced a painful reevaluation of their practices. The city council held emergency sessions. The city's risk management department went into overdrive. It was no longer cheaper to defend problem officers than to discipline them. The liability had become too great. Faced with the threat of further legal action and intense public pressure, the city entered into negotiations with Evelyn Reed and, eventually, the Department of Justice. They agreed to the terms Jada had demanded months earlier. They entered into a formal consent decree, a multi-year agreement mandating sweeping reforms, all overseen by an independent federal monitor. The reforms were comprehensive. The APD was forced to completely rewrite its protocols for interacting with all first responders, paramedics, EMTs, and firefighters. The new policy, which became known informally as the Washington Rule, was explicit. During an active medical emergency, the senior medical professional on scene has authority over patient care. Law enforcement's role was to support and secure, not to command or interfere. Any request for identification or administrative information was to wait until the patient was stabilized and transported. Training at the police academy was overhauled. Every new recruit and every current officer was required to undergo mandatory training co-led by senior paramedics. They watched the unedited body cam footage from the Centennial Park incident. It became a powerful cautionary tale, a case study in what not to do. They were trained to recognize the signs of critical medical distress, not to question the judgment of medical professionals in their own field of expertise. The department also implemented a new early intervention system designed to flag officers who, like Miller, accumulated a pattern of citizen complaints, especially for escalation and abuse of authority. 3 complaints within a 2-year period would now trigger an automatic review and mandatory retraining and counseling. The system that had allowed Miller to operate with impunity for 8 years was dismantled. Jada watched these changes unfold with a sense of weary vindication. The lawsuit had achieved what she set out to do. It wasn't just about the money, which would ensure Marcus Thorne received the best possible care for the rest of his life. It was about forcing the system to change, to build the guardrails that should have been there all along. She received an invitation to speak to the first class of APD recruits graduating under the new training regimen. She stood before a room full of young, nervous faces in crisp blue uniforms, the future of the department. She didn't speak with anger or resentment. She spoke with the calm authority of her profession. "I am a paramedic," she began. "My job is to preserve life. Your job is to protect life. Our missions are not in conflict, they are intertwined. But for that partnership to work, it requires respect. Respect for each other's skills, respect for each other's roles, and most importantly, respect for the citizen we are both sworn to serve." The man whose life was forever altered by this incident was not a suspect. He was a patient. He was a husband and a father. Never forget that. Behind every call, behind every uniform, there is a human being. Your job is to see that humanity first. Her words resonated in the quiet auditorium. She was no longer just a paramedic who had been wrongfully arrested. She had become an agent of change, her personal trauma forged into a powerful catalyst for reform. The city was being forced, kicking and screaming, into a new era of accountability, and her case was the blueprint. The impact of Washington versus City of Atlanta extended far beyond the city limits. The story of the arrest, the trial, and the monumental verdict became a national touchstone. Emergency medical service associations across the country used the case as a teaching tool. The body cam footage became required viewing in paramedic training programs, a stark, real-world lesson on navigating interagency conflict and asserting patient advocacy. Jada, an intensely private person who never sought the spotlight, had become an unwilling icon. She used a significant portion of her settlement to establish a non-profit organization, the First Responder Advocacy Foundation. Its mission was simple: to provide legal support and resources for paramedics, EMTs, and firefighters who faced retaliation, discipline, or arrest for prioritizing patient care over improper demands from law enforcement. The foundation funded legal battles for medics in small towns who didn't have a powerful union or a high-profile attorney like Evelyn Reed. It created a national hotline and developed standardized training modules on the legal rights and duties of first responders at emergency scenes. Jada's ordeal had exposed a systemic vulnerability, and she was now building the shield that would protect others. Inspired by the case, and lobbied by a coalition of EMS and firefighter unions, state legislatures began to take notice. Georgia passed the First Responder Protection Act a year after the verdict. The law explicitly criminalized the act of intentionally obstructing an emergency medical provider who is actively rendering patient care. It codified into law the principle that Jada had fought for. In a medical emergency, the medic is in charge of the patient. Similar bills were introduced in a dozen other states, each one citing Jada's case as the impetus for the legislation. Her personal battle had become a nationwide movement for legal protection. Marcus Thorne never fully recovered. He emerged from his coma after several months, but was left with severe cognitive and physical disabilities. The settlement money ensured he had the best care, but it could not give him back the life he had lost. His wife, Sarah, became a fierce advocate for the new legislation, testifying before state committees. She would tell her family's story, her voice shaking but steady, ending her testimony the same way every time. "My husband is alive today because a paramedic refused to abandon him. This law is for all the other paramedics who might one day have to make that same choice." Jada continued to work as a paramedic at Grady. She turned down offers for administrative positions and speaking tours. The ambulance was her sanctuary, the place where she could still make a tangible difference, one patient at a time. The work was harder now, weighted with the knowledge of how fragile the trust between agencies could be. But it was also different. Officers on scene treated her and her colleagues with a new level of respect. The Washington rule had become part of the lexicon. Young officers trained on her video would sometimes approach her at a scene, a look of recognition and awe in their eyes, and simply say, "Ma'am, let us know what you need." The culture was slowly, painstakingly beginning to shift. The legacy of her fight was not found in the headlines or the dollar amount of the verdict. It was found in these quiet moments of professional respect, in the unspoken understanding that had been forged in the crucible of a courtroom. It was a legacy of protection, built one call, one class, and one law at a time. The quiet hum of the ICU ventilator became the soundtrack to a changed world. Reflecting on it all, it's clear Officer Miller's actions weren't born from a vacuum. His behavior was the logical endpoint of a system that rewarded dominance and punished any perceived challenge. Perhaps he came from a background where control was survival, or maybe years of dealing with the worst of humanity had calcified his empathy. If he had been able to see Jada not as an obstacle to his authority, but as a fellow professional on a shared mission, Marcus Thorne might have walked out of that park. If the 19 prior complaints had resulted in meaningful intervention instead of dismissals, he might have learned the crucial lesson of restraint before it was too late. For Jada, perhaps if she had worn a personal body camera, the objective truth would have been established even faster, without relying on her attacker's own device. If she had immediately and loudly announced, "For your camera, officer, I am deferring your request to save this man's life," she might have planted a seed of doubt in his mind about the legality of his own impending actions. But these are the ghosts of what if. The reality is that on that day, a system failed, and a man's ego was prioritized over a man's life. The profound lesson here is not just that power corrupts, but that true authority is not demanded. It is earned through competence, compassion, and a humble understanding of one's role in the larger tapestry of public service. Jada's fight reminds us that sometimes the most heroic act is not one of dramatic intervention, but one of steadfast refusal. The refusal to be moved from your duty, your ethics, and your humanity, even when the personal cost seems impossibly high. What do you think is the most effective way to prevent incidents like this in the future? Better training, stricter laws, or stronger independent oversight of law enforcement? And if you were on that jury, what part of the evidence would have been most powerful for you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.